So let's get started. A big warm welcome. I'm Alex Arnold. I'm the executive consultant for the Taos Institute.
Y buenos días, vamos a empezar. Bienvenidos a todos. Soy Alex Arnold, la consultora administrativa del Taos Institute, ejecutiva, perdón.
And I'm very pleased to be here today for this event hosted by Montaber Publishing. So thank you so much.
Y me da mucho gusto estar aquí el día de hoy en este evento que está patrocinado por Montaber, por la editorial Montaber.
A word about the Taos Institute. We are a nonprofit educational organization, and we have a mission to create brighter futures, one conversation at a time.
Y somos el Instituto Taos, que tenemos la misión de crear un futuro más brillante, una conversión a la vez. Y somos una organización no lucrativa.
We disseminate social constructionist, relational, and appreciative ideas and practices across disciplines, languages, and regions of the world.
Y diseminamos prácticas apreciativas, colaborativas, la construcción social a través y a lo largo de todo el planeta.
And we do this in a variety of ways. That includes books from Taos Institute publications. We have courses, workshops, free events like this one, and a free online community, the Taos Institute Commons.
Y lo hacemos de varias maneras, a través de libros, cursos, talleres, eventos gratuitos como este, y también a través del Commons del Taos.
And now I will pass it on to Adria Giberno from Montaber Publishing to introduce this event and our speaker.
Y ahora le voy a pasar la palabra a Adria Giberno para que presente a la editorial y a nuestros oradores.
Thank you very much, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone.
Gracias, Alex. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches a todos.
Thank you very much for being here. I am Adria Gibernau, the organizer of this event on behalf of Montaber, a small publisher based in Barcelona.
No, como más torta.
No, como así. Y yo soy Adria Giberno de la editorial Montaber.
And well, today we're going to have this amazing conversation between Ken Gergen and Michael Billig. And it will be about an hour, and at the end you will be able to ask some questions written in the chat.
Hoy vamos a tener esta conversación entre Kenneth Gergen y Michael Billig, que durará más o menos una hora, y después de eso tendrán la oportunidad de mandar sus preguntas a través del chat.
So first of all, let me introduce you to Lupicinio Íñiguez, also called Lupi.
Y ahora déjenme presentarles a Lupicinio Íñiguez, llamado Lupi.
He will make a short introduction to introduce our participants.
Que va a hacer una breve introducción para presentar a nuestros oradores el día de hoy.
He holds a PhD in psychology and he's a professor at the Department of Social Psychology at Universitat Autónoma de Barcelona.
Y tiene un doctorado y tiene una posición en la Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona.
He's a member of the Barcelona Science and Technology Studies Group.
Y es miembro del Grupo de Ciencia y Tecnología de Barcelona.
And coordinator of the PhD program Person and Society in the Contemporary World.
Y coordina el doctorado de Persona y Sociedad en el Mundo Contemporáneo.
He's an editor of several international journals.
Edita algunos journals internacionales.
And his research is focused on development of qualitative methods in social sciences and discourse analysis.
Y su investigación está basada en desarrollo de métodos de investigación cualitativa.
So Lupicinio will be speaking in Spanish. Then I will have back the word to make some summary of what he said.
Y Lupi va a hablar en español y después Adria va a hacer un resumen de lo que Lupi diga.
And finally, we will let you hear Ken and Michael, that I think that at the end is what you all want to.
Y finalmente les permitiremos escuchar a Ken y a Michael, que es lo que vinieron a hacer aquí el día de hoy.
So Lupi, the floor is yours.
So, Lupi, el piso es tuyo.
Gracias. Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches. Gracias a Adria y a la editorial Montaber por proporcionarnos esta ocasión de escuchar una conversación entre Ken y Mike, viejos amigos que reencuentro después de unos cuantos años. Puedo hacer una presentación muy objetiva, pero en realidad voy a hacer una presentación muy emotiva, porque la importancia que estas dos personas tienen para la psicología social y para mí en particular es de tal tamaño que no puedo dejar de conmoverme al intentar presentarlos. Los dos, Mike and Ken son dos personas que cambian y a mí me produce una gran admiración las personas que cambian. Al igual que Jerome Brunner, además, Mike and Ken han cambiado transitando por diversas orientaciones y posiciones epistemológicas de la psicología y cada vez han sido importantes en lo que han hecho. Han sido importantes antes de ser psicólogos críticos y han sido importantes después de ser psicólogos críticos, psicólogos. Y esto me parece absolutamente genial. Ken es profesor, creo que ahora se dice profesor senior de psicología en el Southmont College y es el promotor y alma mater del Instituto Taos que ya hace un momento Alex presentó. Con una formación y un primer trabajo absolutamente convencional dentro de la psicología mainstream, a partir del año 1973 se convirtió en un icono y en un líder de la psicología crítica. El texto Social Psychology as History es un texto capital que presentaba una crítica feroz a la investigación experimental como una forma neutral de leer el comportamiento social humano. Las ideas presentadas en ese artículo provocaron una enorme controversia que convirtieron a Gergen en una de las referencias obligadas de la psicología social crítica y en protagonista de lo que después hemos conocido como movimiento socioconstruccionista. Es conocido internacionalmente por sus contribuciones al construccionismo social, la tecnología y el cambio cultural, el yo, el envejecimiento, la educación y otros más temas. Sus principales escritos, algunos de ellos traducidos al castellano, son Realidades y Relaciones, El yo saturado o Una invitación a la construcción social. Es una suerte que hayamos podido encontrar estos importantes textos en castellano. La creación del Taos Institute es una contribución central de Gergen porque ahí se materializó el compromiso del construccionismo y de la psicología relacional con el cambio y la transformación social. Mike Billig, por su parte, trabajó con Henry Tajfel produciendo importantes resultados en el marco de la teoría de la identidad social. Pero abandonó esta orientación para erigirse también en un líder de las versiones alternativas de la psicología. Billig trabajó durante más de 30 años en Loughborough, de donde es jubilado en este momento, y fue jefe del Departamento de Ciencias Sociales y vicedecano de la Facultad de Estudios Humanos y Ambientales. Uno de los hitos de su carrera fue la publicación del libro Arguing and Thinking, desafortunadamente no disponible en castellano, aunque espero que la editorial Montaber se anime a traducirlo. Esta es una obra monumental que acaba por ser el inicio de la principal alternativa al cognitivismo dominante en la psicología, que es, le podemos dar ya ese nombre, la psicología discursiva. Mike fue un pionero en la conceptualización de la psicología retórica y sus contribuciones en los campos de la historia de la psicología, la retórica del lenguaje político, el psicoanálisis, el nacionalismo y la exploración del fascismo. Además, durante su carrera, también ha integrado en su agenda temas como el racismo académico, las teorías de la mente en el siglo XVIII, el humor, el rock and roll y el estado actual de la forma en que escribimos las ciencias sociales. Un trabajo que representa una nueva concepción de cuál sería la erudición en la sociedad y en la academia contemporánea. Solo una obra de Mike Billig ha sido traducida al catalán y al castellano hasta ahora, que era Nacionalismo banal. Ahora tenemos la traducción de Ideología y Opiniones gracias a esta editorial, con lo cual no podemos sino felicitarnos. Pero en su haber, Mike cuenta también la composición de un departamento estrella en el campo de la ciencia social crítica, atrayendo investigadores que han consolidado la investigación crítica en general y la psicología social crítica en particular, como Jonathan Potter, Derek Edwards, Charles Antaki o Susan Condon. Fue miembro fundador del importantísimo grupo Discurso y Retórica, que es en realidad un entorno intelectual de primer orden en las ciencias sociales a escala mundial, que ha repercutido en la anti-mainstream y en la psicología social crítica alternativa. Bien, es un privilegio entonces tener la oportunidad de asistir a una conversación entre estas dos figuras clave y celebrar al mismo tiempo la feliz noticia de la traducción al castellano de estos dos libros de sendos autores. Muchas gracias. Adrià, te paso la palabra nuevamente.
Thank you, Lupi. Thank you very much. I will now make this translation, this summary. But first of all, I would like to kindly ask you to join the simultaneous translation channel. If Silvia, you can translate me here.
Once I have my channel ready.
Sure. So, if Silvia is working here, me voy a traducir yo mismo. Ahora mismo, para la gente que habla español, vamos a abrir un canal de traducción simultánea, con lo cual ustedes van a poder entrar ahí y escuchar todo lo que digan tanto Ken como Michael de manera simultánea en español. Entonces, Alex, if we can open it. It's working already? Great.
Yes.
Vale, pues I will be talking in Spanish just to let the Spanish speakers know how can they access here. Para los oyentes que son españoles, les pido que vayan abajo. Acaba de aparecer una redonda, un icono de un globo terráqueo, y aquí pone interpretación. Encima de interpretación pueden seleccionar el tipo de audio que quieren escuchar. En el original van a escuchar lo que están diciendo en inglés tanto Ken como Michael. Y si van al que pone Spanish, van a poder escuchar la traducción simultánea por parte de Silvia London. All right, I think we are all set up. And I see that Silvia is already translating. So fantastic. Let's go ahead. Let me make a short summary of what Lupi just said. Actually, what he was saying is that between Lupi, Mike, and Ken, they are really old friends, so it's very hard to have an objective presentation of them, but rather it's always necessary to have an emotional presentation of them. What he was highlighting is that both Ken and Michael have changed during their academic career, as Jerome Brunner did as well. They took several positions all through the years inside psychology, and they were always important in every single position of them. Ken Gergen is a senior professor at Swarthmore College. He did an amazing work that was published in 1975 that it was called Social Psychology as History. It was extremely controversial. And he was a main character in how to transform how psychology was understood all during years. I'll go now with Michael Billig. Michael Billig is the leader of what Lupi was calling an alternative psychology. And he was professor in the University of Loughborough, and he wrote an amazing book called Arguing and Thinking that it's not translated yet into Spanish. I hope we can go with that soon. And basically what Lupi was saying about Michael is that he created an alternative to cognitive psychology. And I think that here it was the same with Ken. His writings are regarding racism, and the only book that has been translated into Spanish until now is Banal Nationalism. And now, of course, we have Ideology and Opinions, just translated by our publisher. It is a privilege to assist to this meeting. And that's a short summary of what Lupi just said. I would like to make another short introduction, and I let you hear the two main characters here. And it's the fact that originally we thought about this event as an occasion to promote Ken's Relational Imperative book that we just translated into Spanish, and also Ideology and Opinions that we also translated into Spanish. But easily talking to them, we realized that the books are not that important. For sure they are, but the books are not that important as this meeting can be. It is a meeting of two people that have devoted their entire lives to be critic about social psychology. And it is fantastic to have you all here, and especially to have you, Ken, and have you, Michael, here. I know that you are friends for a long time, and you have lots of things to talk about. So it will be a pleasure to listen to you, and also it will be a pleasure to listen to read your comments, to the comments of all of you, that you can write them on the chat. Unfortunately, we will not open the floor for the questions because, as you have seen, there are lots of us here, and it would be really difficult to take all the questions. But in an hour or so, I will take some of them and I will pass them to Ken and Michael. You can write them either in Spanish or you can write them in English. Also, as Alex is putting now in the chat, all of you have a 20% of discount in the books that we just translated from Ken, The Relational Imperative, and from Michael, Ideology and Opinions, both in Spanish. You have the details on the chat. And from now, I think that those are all the presentations that we had to do. Ken, I give you the word, and please feel free to go ahead.
Thanks so much, Adria. I promised Mick I would open this by asking him an unanswerable question, just to get started. But before I ask that question, Mick, Adria, I just want to thank you so much for generating this event. In large part because it's a chance to get together with Mick again. I don't think we've been face to face for maybe 2 decades at least. Maybe Istanbul was the last time. So that's been a joy, and we promised we would see each other frequently again. And also to see Lupe again. It's a place we've just had many, many good times together at Autonoma and elsewhere. And also this brief glimpse of people I've known from so many parts of my life. To have that together for me is really, really significant. And Mick, all right, I've been inspired by you for so many years and so many texts that you've written. It's been a companion in arms, a provocateur, always interesting ideas coming out that come from seemingly nowhere. But that's my point of my question. We've been sort of nominated as designated deviants, people who've somehow broken the rules. Call them boundaries, call them oppression, but we've somehow not lived in that space. Why are you so deviant?
You say that's unanswerable. I could provide an answer. It wouldn't be true. I could say, well, it's all my parents' fault. I didn't choose it. It just happened. Unlike you've been very socially minded throughout your academic career. You've made contacts with practical psychologists. You've given help to practical psychologists. You're very socially responsible in terms of your ideas. I've just done things, and I've done things without choosing to. It just happens. I write this book, then I get bored and write that book. It's as if I don't have control over what I do. And I very much envy you, who has had almost a project to do, a project which involves other people. And if you ask me what was my project, I would say, unfortunately, I don't have one. It's just going from thing to thing.
Well, now you've had, in some ways, had to sort of fight upstream. I mean, you're not doing mainstream work. There's no necessary audience for that. You can't count on anyone reading it. Certainly, you're not content talking to yourself. So if you had to give an account, let's not go back to childhood, but what have been the supports for that? What have been the aids? What has made that worthwhile for you?
I don't know, but what I do know is that we talked about this last night, but my teacher in social psychology was very different from the person you studied under social psychology to become a social psychologist. My teacher was a very great thinker, I think, Henri Tajfel, who I owe so much to. And he wasn't a straightforward social psychologist. He always said that he turned to social psychology to understand how genocide was possible. Mm-hmm. And for him, that question had greater priority than a methodological approach or a theory. And I've just been following on his coattails in that respect.
Well, the genocide issue wasn't central to your work, but something I take it about Tajfel, who, by the way, always seemed to be a kind of narcissistic bully from my perspective, but you worked closely with him. But something about, I gather, the intensity of that search for him must have given you a sense of direction. Before you come back to that, let me just say, yes, I did have a quite different mentor in that respect, Edward E. Jones, or Ned Jones, who really just taught me a trade. I mean, social psychology, it was not particularly interesting intellectually. It was all about arranging experiments to come out in a way that would allow you to gain publications. I mean, it was a real one-upsmanship game in a way which looked like it was creating knowledge, but let's put that aside for a few minutes. But let me say that if I had a counterpart to your experience with a mentor, it would probably be Sigmund Koch, whose work I'm not sure you know because he didn't publish that much, but he was charismatic, brilliant theoretician who I had as a couple of seminars. That just exploded the field for me. I mean, here's someone who was thoughtful, engaging, irreverent, who could teach positivism, but with a kind of twinkle in his eye, like, don't take it seriously. And it was that launch into the spectrum of ideas and the enchantment with the ideas that really that's what sort of just curdled there as a potential for me. And I think eventually led to kind of an explosion out of the containment of positivism. But the idea of a mentor who opens up a space that you want to occupy somehow, or you find yourself at home in, I think that's really important.
Yes, I think so. You see, when I stopped doing experiments after I got my PhD, Henri Tajfel understood why. He never said, "Oh, you must come back and do experiments." He understood there were much more important things than experiments. There were, for him, he was always reading anthropology, history particularly. He had great sense that we will understand more about society through reading history than actually doing experiments. And I think that permission which he gave me was very, very important. So in one sense, unlike you, I didn't feel I was really rebelling against my major teacher.
I did. I think for me, working in experimentation, I mean, I was young. I had already a family when I went to graduate school. I needed to do well. I needed to provide. And so I simply embraced the program, do well as an experimentalist, and I devoted myself to that, which was very successful. Managed to land a job at Harvard because I had done so much work as a graduate student. But all the time, there's this kind of festering ambivalence about it, kind of an internal critique of myself. It just like festered there for a number of years. And it was only when given the opportunity at a meeting to talk about some of these ideas and then the invitation to write for the journal, it just all came out. I didn't, somewhat, I didn't mean to. I wasn't trying to, place a bomb anywhere. I was inviting a dialogue. Come join, let's work this out. How can we be doing science if there's no accumulation? For example, how can we do science if all the language is in some way heavily laden with ideology or values, and so on? But it was taken as a slam in the face, and what I thought was going to be a dialogue rather turned out to be a knife fight. It got very ugly with my mentor eventually writing in a handbook. Comes, I think, from Auden. The dogs bark in the night and the caravan moves on. That was who I was.
Yeah, I never had that, and certainly not from Toshville. In fact, what I had for him was an entry into the academic world. And paradoxically, he was much better at formulating ideas than operationalizing them. And for that, I'm very grateful, because my first job, which he hired me for after I graduated as an undergraduate, was to design and run an experiment for him. And I was very grateful that I had that entry. Whereas I shouldn't think that your mentor ever would have been in that position and hiring you to design his experiments for him.
Are you trying to tell me that you were the one who did those classic experiments on the
intergroup thing? Yes. Toshville explained what he wanted, but he wanted to create an experiment which showed whether, if you just categorize someone and the category had no meaning at all, whether they'd be influenced by it. And he said he needed someone to design that, put that into an experimental situation. And I said, yeah, fine.
A whole career was waiting for you.
Yeah. Yes.
What's fascinating,
but it taught me that the important thing was the idea.
Yeah.
And it was a brilliant idea of his. I could have studied experimental social psychology for 50 years and I would never have had that idea.
You've had a lot of other ones of major significance.
But not that one.
It's paradoxical in a way that there he is, and if you look at the continent, there was Serge Moscovici, and these were like leaders in Europe, almost a battle between the British and the Continentals. And if you looked at the United States, probably Leon Festinger was the major character in social psychology at the time at Stanford. And I don't think any of them were experimentalists. Sayers, not really. Festinger, not really. They had other people to do that work. So there are these three figures, none of whom do experiments, and the field is like down there typing away and working away with calculators and designing things in spaces to create results. When really the action, the fun is in the ideas. Yeah.
Well, when I turned away from experiments, and it was because I was studying the extreme right in Britain at the time. You can't do experiments to study the extreme right. You have to study the extreme right. And I said to Henri Tajfel, I thought experiments were artificial. And he put me right. He said experiments are metaphors. They're metaphors. They help you explain your ideas. And I thought he was absolutely correct.
Yeah. No, and I believe that. They're nice little examples, illustrations, which you could have done in many other ways, but they're compelling little illustrations, not knowledge laid up in some kind of book of heaven. I was just trying to think. All right, so there was this explosion for me, but after that, there's a sense of being driven by the critique and finding the critique of what I'd done pretty much shallow. But in arguing against the critique, it opens up, new doors that they may have been implicit in what you'd done, but not explicit until someone challenged you. So for me, the kind of critique of what I'd done, well, let me give you an example, because it festered for a long time. It's really important. Okay, the only critique I really found that had some substance is, look, you're right about the ephemera. Social life moves on, but we're really interested in the eternal verities. States, conditions, processes of mind that remain there, and they may be manifest in many, many ways. But those remain solid and part of human nature. That was a tough one. That raised the whole question for me, then how do we know what those states and conditions and processes are? How could we ever get to them? What would that be like? And so that opens up a space for hermeneutics. How do we understand? What is the nature of human understanding? And now I'm outside psychology. The first time I presented any of this to a psychology colloquium, someone said, Herman who? Or hermeneutics. But where it goes, and come back to you, is I can find no account, no foundation, no logical account of how one could access a subjectivity or another state of mind. There was no one who could explain, indeed, the process of communication as intersubjectivity. So that essentially meant that whatever we're calling mind in itself, you might say, is metaphoric. So then I'm drawn to one of your books about that time, basically the argument and cognition, because it seemed to me what you had done is gone back to rhetoric, which you might look at as sort of the early constructionism. That is the way you form the argument, not the substance so much, the form of it. And if everything that we would call rational is in fact a realization of rhetoric, then it begins to undermine the whole notion of cognition. Cognition is just another way of talking about rhetoric. Why reify the cognitive? Why not stay with the rhetoric? And now we're off into a whole different space. And I really appreciated that book a lot, and it's challenging for me.
Well, can I respond in two ways? One to what you said about rhetoric and how I came to it. But first, you said that you came to the idea of mind being interrelational. And of course, we both wish there were present between us a third person, John Schotter, who was so influential to us both, and such a dear friend, and we both miss him greatly.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah,
Yes,
could take a moment to say he was so dear to us both.
And a proper intellectual, that any conversation with him, he would bring out these word-for-word quotations from Wittgenstein or from other great philosophers. He was a walking library. He was a wonderful person.
There would be moments when he would make a long-distance phone call to say, I have to share this quote from Bakhtin. You have to listen to this.
Yes.
And I'd come back, a few weeks later. Have you seen this part of the papers of Wittgenstein? Look at this one. It was great fun. Yeah.
Yes, a great scholar. Now, why I came to rhetoric was through Tajfel and through politics. He had an idea that categorization, the processes of categorization, lay at the basis of prejudice. Now, I began to think that this was a dangerous idea for a simple reason. But if you think the basis of categorization give rise to prejudice and the exaggeration of differences between people, and you think that categorization is universal, that every language, every perceptual process demands categorization, you are saying that prejudice is universal. And in my study of the far right, I'd come across far rightists saying this. By this time, unfortunately, Henri Tajfel had died. I never got to discuss this problem with him, which I would have appreciated. But I felt there must be a way that you avoid saying that prejudice and categorization are universal. And the way for me was quite simple. It was to say that there are different forms of categorization, and the categorization which leads to prejudice is verbal categorization, is rhetorical categorization. And I found this in the works of the great rhetoricians, and what they all said or implied was, if you say one thing, sort of people are all a group, you can say the opposite. No, people are all different. You can categorize, but with rhetoric, there's always the opposite argument. You say, well, yes, people belong to a group and groups are different, but also people are all the same as well. And these are verbal arguments. At the time, linguists were making a lot of fuss about Chomsky's work and talking about the universals of language, grammar being one of the universals. And they tended not to emphasize what I think is the basic universal of language, that every language has a way of saying no. Every language has a negative. And that means every language enables you to say opposite things. And so we're not necessarily just have to be prejudiced or have to talk in categories. We can argue against the categories. And that was the basis of why I went into rhetoric.
Let me pick up there, because there are parts of that I find myself resisting a little bit. It seems to me that all language, in effect, institutionally or unintentionally, sustains a tradition of some kind which rules out others. That all discourse, whether it is looked at as prejudicial, in effect is prejudicial implicitly. And that's part of the whole decolonialization issue right now. I think it's built into Foucault. Wherever you've got language and the sharing of that language, it becomes ideological. So I don't know whether we can step out of that, but all right, so there's negation. The question is, for me, when is the negation set in motion? That is, you could be Derrida and simply strike out, well, strike through every word you say to say, well, yes, but no. And often I feel that way when I write something. I wish there were some way of saying, well, look, I don't take this dead seriously. It's an idea. You can cross it through. But it's so easy with language to come into a space of this is so, and without the negation. And at that point, here we are warring against traditionalists in our own field. And here we are in a political battle in the United States, which is devastating in its consequences. And here we are in Israel and Palestine, and we cannot see beyond yes and no. And that's the part that's frightening to me, that there's no humility, no sense, or very little sense of, well, yes, I'm saying this, but actually I could unsay it. I could actually take your perspective, and we could.
Well,
so,
let me put it this way, is because we have negation in every language, but every established view can be challenged. It's possible to have the opposite thought. We often don't, but it's always there. Every dictator should be haunted by the prospect that someone's going to come up and say, no, you're wrong. You're absolutely wrong for these reasons. And I think language enables us to do this, whether or not we actually fulfill our obligation to question, and whether sometimes we don't.
This is an aside, but one of the reasons I've really been interested in aesthetics and the whole arts-based movement and the social sciences, it gives us some other languages, and which is and is not, are not the basis. There is not an is not to a dance movement. So if you could introduce other forms of relating, other forms of communication, that kind of issue would be diminished.
Yes, but it's not sorry, yeah. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, let me just pose this. Look, our whole educational system generally is based on what is and is not, and you get gold stars for getting all the ises and is nots right. It does have that sense of there are right answers and wrong answers. And this is the way the world is, and anything else is not. I mean, it's built into positivism. It's built into our educational system. So isn't there a sense in which our whole public education system indeed support the idea of once you've got an is, anything else is problematic or offensive? I mean, do we have to retrain to be able to do both is and is not simultaneously?
Well, you need to look at history and at those moments when new ideas turn the old ones over, or at those moments when it seems impossible that people could think in any other way, and we forget that they once did. Let me, you mentioned what is happening in Gaza, which I think is absolutely terrible. And it seems like there is an impasse, and that on both sides, but I think also in recent weeks, particularly on the Israeli side, there is a sense of being unable to think of the enemy as anything but the enemy, and not be worried about the rising deaths. Now, I found myself thinking about Walter Benjamin, the great critic of the 1930s and 1940s, and his philosophy of history, where he says that in moments of danger, some views are about to disappear and become impossible. But this is because history is written by those who triumph. And what I find myself thinking about is both a very personal and a very social moment of history. It's personal because I am not the first person called Billig to work in a university and to study language. My father's brother, and they grew up in a very poor home in London, went to Cambridge. His brother went to Cambridge, became what was called a philologist, studied ancient Greek and ancient Latin. He had also won awards for his knowledge of ancient Hebrew, which had been taught as a young boy. And then after he graduated, he turned to the study of Arabic. And for the rest of his life, he studied Muslim philosophy, Shiite philosophy, particularly medieval poets in Arabic. And as such, he was picked up by the new Hebrew University of Jerusalem, which was founded in 1926. And he became the first lecturer in Arabic studies. And it was the leader of the university wanted to create an Arabic studies department because he felt so strongly that any Jewish society, and at that time it was the time of the Mandate, Palestine was ruled by the British, that any Jewish home in Palestine would need to be at peace with Arabs, and Jews and Arabs must live together and must study each other's culture, and particularly Jews must learn Arabic. And my father's brother, my uncle, whom I never met, was very strongly committed to teaching Jews Arabic language, ancient Arabic, and teaching them to study the traditions of Islam. But only if they did that could they understand their own Jewish tradition. He was at work on a huge book about Shiite philosophy and Shiite medieval poetry. And he was, during a time in 1936, after he'd been in the university for 10 years, a time of great tension and revolt by Arabs against the situation. And there was violence. And he was working late in the night on his book when a gunman broke into his house and shot him dead. And the newspapers published pictures of his blood-stained Arabic books, which he was working on. Now, my father never talked about his brother. This has come, really, my knowledge of this has come since October, since I've been thinking about Walter Benjamin and what's been the awfulness of what's been happening in Palestine. And I don't want to leave the story there because it's only half the story. If I left it there, it would be like saying, oh, Jews, they can't trust the Arabs. My father's brother belonged to a small group which felt that the Jews must never predominate over the Arabs. And some said after he was killed, oh, this just shows you can't trust Arabs. He had many Arab friends, but, well, this is what they do to him. But it wasn't. We have to remember a forgotten past as it disappears. And forgive me for talking at length about this, but I feel it so strongly. The first Arab to study at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem studied under my father's brother, Levi Billig. The name of the student was Hamdi Nubani, and they became very close friends, close collaborators. And Nubani was absolutely shocked by Levi's murder. In years to come, Hamdi Nubani picked up the teaching of my father's brother, my uncle. And whereas Levi had become a Jewish student of the Quran, Hamdi, in direct mirror image, became a Muslim Talmudist who studied the Talmud. Now, it seems now impossible with the present situation to have such people. Their memory is about to be forgotten, as if this cannot happen. And this is why we have to grab moments from the past, just when they seem to be disappearing. And if, like me, you're related to one of those people who symbolize a different past, a different path which history could have taken, it's an obligation to remember. And
yeah.
I can recall a Talmudic saying, and I am absolutely sure that both Levi Billig and Hamdi Nubani will be able to point to me and tell me what is the Islamic equivalent of this expression. And the expression is that scholars, and the Hebrew is normally translated as scholars increase the peace of the world. And that's why I think we have to keep being scholars. Bad scholars don't increase the peace of the world. But those two people which I've mentioned were genuine scholars, and if only the peace of the world had been increased by people listening to them. Sorry, thank you.
No, it's a beautiful and touching story, and I hope somehow you can find ways to keep that memory salient to us. But let me tell you, I have worried for a lot of my scholarly life about whether we do anything very much at all. That is, we don't talk in ways that people can understand. It's hard to find our work. You have to be quite literate to get into it. Do we please ourselves? And that has bothered me a lot, especially if you say what we were trying to do to establish knowledge in the traditional sense is, let's say, a mobile army of metaphors, in Nietzsche's terms. It is a construction. It's not solid, predictable knowledge, a construction of the world. And that part, for me, has really led to trying to settle myself in the community of people who are actually working in society, who are in organizations, who are doing therapy, doing community work, in education. It's been the whole basis to me, of the Taos Institute, try to bring the scholars and those people who are actually on the line teaching people, what are the practices of teaching which would lead to the possibility of being able to understand both sides of the coin, of possibilities of pedagogies of mutual care instead of isolation and competition, or in organizations getting rid of top-down organizational surveillance mechanistics. How could you create humane organizations? And people are doing those things. And how to support that, reinforce it, get it shared with other people. So that's part of why I've moved a lot of my concerns in the direction of engagement with the outside, because I just fear the what we're doing and how much it contributes. And maybe it does, but it just eats on me a little bit. Does the world need another publication in some rarefied journal that nobody reads? Yeah, even if it's brilliant.
No, but you're right. And you're right to be questioning yourself about it. I may have misquoted that Talmudic text because I think it applies exactly to the sorts of things you're doing and seeking to do, which is that scholars, I think I said brings peace, but it isn't. It's increase peace in the world. And that surely is what you're doing. It may not be a vast increase, but it is an increase.
Let me ask you a question, Mick, because it's been of concern to me too. And you and I have both been very active in what you might call critical psychology for one reason or another. And I value that effort a lot. But I also came to feel over time that the critical impulse, the way we've done it, indeed contributes to antagonisms. But so often it seems judgmental and to place those we critique into a corner of implied evil. And it's been, even though I believe in that critical work, it's part of me that stops short, that says, look, this is dangerous. Just critique is the essence of othering, of creating an other that's different and strange and wrong. Does that ever bother you, or do you think about that at all?
Yes, of course. Absolutely. And I take it that this is one reason you moved to out of the university in some ways, that some of your most important work has not been done in a university department. Now, I never moved out of a university. And I think I've been restricted because of that, because universities now are competitive commercial institutions, which will commercialize any critical impulse, and you're meant to stand behind your approach and make certain it's bigger than other universities' approaches. I don't like it. It makes me hide away, which is not to my credit.
Yeah, I don't advise people in the United States, young students, to go into that scholarship at this point, because of just the kinds of things you've said, where they're basically companies, and you're hired to produce work at your mill, produce articles, gain fame for the university and money, grant money. That's your job. And teach on the side, because that some of the students are paying tuition, but it's yeah. Where is the space there for deviance? But I do want to say, look, I just come back from a conference on qualitative psychology, and their deviance is everywhere. There's a lot of bravery. There are people who are doing incredible kinds of work there, bringing in the arts, performance, action research, inventing new ways of working, bringing in colonialist influences into the activities of the research and so on. It's I stand there and I'm just like amazed and inspired by what's happening with young people in that area. Just some universities can't tolerate that, but then Loughborough became really a significant place because you could publish discursive work, and that was that was easier to do than experimental work, and you could generate publications. So Loughborough became like one of a major research institution, didn't it?
Yes, it was a lovely place to work and very friendly place.
Yeah.
But the university has become very successful in its own terms, and that is a danger. It's easy to be corrupted in academic work by success, by getting grants, by becoming a big leader or whatever.
Yeah.
And scholars need to be humble. I need to know.
I don't know whether we should be turning these over to questions or whether. What do you think, Lupe?
Hi, Ken, Michael. Thank you very much for this amazing talk. I think there are so many questions here, and I'm seeing that way more are appearing here in the chat. From now, I would like to get a question that Bo Alese asked from Denmark. And he was saying, Isaiah Berlin once coined the terms of hedgehog, following a single idea, perhaps Ken, and fox, who is more experience-driven, perhaps Michael, as types of understanding writers and thinkers. Given the many changes in psychology within universities around the world, what are your thoughts on the future of the deviant psychology? Are there possibilities for both foxes and hedgehogs in future universities? Or are we all replaced by quantitative-oriented entrepreneurs?
You want to go first, Ken?
It's a complicated question, and a lot has to do with government, economics, and so on, and the declining numbers of students going to universities. There are a lot of issues about what gains and what loses, where the place of scholarship and inventiveness are. I will say that, at least in psychology for a moment, as I've watched what's happening in the qualitative, as psychology has opened the space for qualitative inquiry, and this is both in the UK and here, and in many universities now in Europe, as you have a European qualitative, that the excitement there among young people and the sense of being able to do something that is worthwhile, that speaks to issues of contemporary significance, it's unlike anything I've ever seen in terms of, let's say, the old-fashioned laboratory counting statistics, which seems abstract, remote, and machine-like, and very far away from the problems that we face. So I guess what I'm saying is that I, in some way, trust that excitement to generate the kind of creative spirit, communal spirit that could generate internal change within the system. That's a hope, but at least something is happening there. It's like you can feel this groundswell of, yes, we can change, we can move toward freedom, and also there's a wonderful sense there, by the way, to go back to something you said, Mick, of live and let live. It's not my method versus your method. It's more like, oh, you do that? That's interesting. I do this. Well, maybe I could also learn from you. There's a cross-pollination and not this kind of antagonism that I find between the phenomenologists and the action researchers and so on. So as a community, to me, it also had that sense of, yes, this is peace at work. And I like to think that that's the future.
Yes. I went back to the quotation from Isaiah Berlin, and I may have misrepresented. Unfortunately, I'm not like our dear friend John, who always remembered quotations properly. But I think it was that he said that the hedgehog knows one thing, and the fox doesn't even know one thing. Knows lots of things, but they're not one big thing, not lots of little things. Now, I would also comment that you and I are of an age where we've had our time. We've had our moments, the exciting moments of being rebellious and whatever. And that the future of the world depends on future generations. And we shouldn't be telling them, the future generations, trying to control them, telling them, you must think in this way, you must think in that way. We just hope that they have lessons to teach us and to succeed where our generation didn't.
Thank you very much. And I go with another question from John Dixon, which says, my question concerns the relationship between psychology and history, a topic on which you both have written previously and spoken about today. I am part of a project in which psychologists and historians are trying to work together on a common project, namely a study of anti-Catholicism in the UK post-1945. My question is, what is your latest thinking on how we might transcend the limits of how psychology has mistreated history? Conversely, perhaps more difficult, what does your discipline have to offer to historians? That's a tough question.
You want to try that first, Vic?
Okay. I think if you talk generally about psychology and history, psychology does this, history does that, you miss the point.
Yeah.
The historians are always saying, be particular. Don't talk about history in general, talk about this bit of history and that bit of history. And sometimes the big questions should be put aside and you should deal with the small examples. I was going to say something else, but I've forgotten it.
All right, I'll give you a chance to catch up. My feeling, yes, you can do psychology and you can account for history. You can do history and account for everything in psychology. You can do psychohistory. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which those can be elided or eliminate each other. My orientation here is basically constructionist, and that is, look, if we're going to do history, realize that that is a form of narrative. It's a narrative construction. And the point is really to be able to say something that is significant with that way of with whatever history you're going to do, but to also look at that as an input into society, which may have implications and effects. So you're not doing it neutrally. It is going to have, if it is understood, it's going to enter into society as a potential change maker. And then ask yourself reflectively, what is that going to do? Yes, it may champion a side, but who's left out of that? Is this going to isolate us more? Is this a judgment which is only going to push people further apart? One cannot step out of ideology. One can't step out of responsibility for what they enter, what they do in a field. So after that, psychology helps you, use it. If it doesn't, but tell the story that you need to tell with a reflection on what this is going to do to society and who values that and who may not, and will it contribute, you might say, to a world in which we can all live together.
I've remembered what I was going to say is raised the question also whether people in different periods are the same or are different. And there could be no real history, no stories of history, if one age couldn't understand the thinking in a previous age. There is a universal aspect of history as well as a particular aspect. But in some sense, people are the same. In other senses, and where you draw for boundaries is the key.
Okay, so let's carry on. We have about 13 minutes left. I go with a question now from Aidan Gulerche. I think probably I didn't pronounce it right. And besides thanking you, she's saying that over the past years, neither much has changed in psychology, nor my central concern or question since the meeting in Istanbul. So my sincere question, she says, goes to both designated deviants. Why do you think still in 2024, so-called critical psychologists as socially engaged individuals, agents, are a socially engaged individual agent, sorry, that was a long sentence, themselves cannot reflect on their own work and shy away making the discipline simply as a study of sociopolitically transformative intersubjectives, rather perpetuate its traditional epistemological, ontological, moral commitments, as if its hegemonic mission is remaking a globally standard and maybe Americanized and governable citizens or individuals. Sorry, that was a long question, and I would appreciate if the next ones can be a little bit shorter and maybe with some dots in the.
In short, what would that be asking? I mean, the question is so many clauses in it, it's difficult at the end to know what the actual brunt of the question is.
Okay, so I will go with another question that it's a bit shorter and I can breathe better. From Marco Gemignani, that he's asking, do you have a particular opinion about the current decolonial trend in psychology? Do you see any risk or concern in it?
Well, I can answer that quite simply because over the years I've given up keeping up with psychology and reading it properly. And so I don't really know this decolonial trend. I'm sort of dimly aware of it, but I certainly couldn't pronounce on it.
Okay, I've just come back from this conference in which decolonial issues are been front and center, among others. First of all, the colonial critique is really essential, and that we in psychology are realizing the Western dominating orientation that we've had as a sort of, we have a universal science, and our ontology is a universal ontology. I mean, it's deeply, in some way, it's implicitly oppressive, and it's important to be put on notice that, look, you have a stance, and that stance is robbing us of voice, robbing us of validity in other parts of the world. I think that's absolutely essential. Now, having said that, you've got several ways to go. One is, okay, so does that mean you stop doing what you're doing? I mean, you don't want to say, well, because it is a tradition, therefore you should stop it because there are other traditions you're not recognizing. You don't want to just eliminate it. You do want to move, however, into somehow incorporating the non-Western ontologies, epistemologies, and so on, values into a universal psychology. So the how to generate that discussion without it breaking down into me versus you, or which is the better, that's the real question. On the other hand, there's another space that bothers me a little bit, and I don't have a total answer. There's a sense in which, okay, we should honor all the traditions. But in doing that, are we then going to say, well, look, we should have isolated traditions then? There should be a form of African psychology, of Chinese, Islamic, whatever the point may be, and they should do their own thing. So everybody should stay in their space and nurture their tradition, enrich their tradition, generate community around those traditions. And the ultimate upshot of that is a set of isolated, non-communicating monads. So that trend bothers me a bit. It's how you get them to speak, and but will integration sap the energy from the traditions. Once you start talking together and start melding, then you have actually now creating a hybrid. But then, of course, all traditions are hybrids. So I don't have so much a bottom line on that as to say that kind of an awareness of how we're moving and where that's going and what we're sensitive to.
Yes, I would agree. You can't give tradition a blank check because it's my tradition.
Yeah.
That is very dangerous.
Okay, I keep going with another question. This one is from Joan Pujol from Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona. And he is asking, while discursive and constructionist perspective gave us the means to deconstruct objectivist narratives of reality, we now face the rise of the far right in the United States and Europe, which employs counterfactual conspiracy rhetoric that challenges the current status quo. Given this context, what perspectives and methodological tools do you think we should develop to effectively counter the constructionist rhetoric of international far right movements? Sorry.
Shall I take this first?
Please.
Then? Yeah. I would say that you don't specify them in advance. You use what you need to use to counter ideas which you think are wrong and dangerous. The ideas may, for instance, be deconstructing an ideology and showing but it's not as it appears, or it could be something much more restricted, that you're undermining statistics which are being quoted time and time again. And there's no doubt that someone like Trump is quoting numbers at times in dreadful ways and wrong numbers. And the errors need to be pointed out. And this is why I'm slightly worried if psychologists, rebellious psychologists say, oh, there's no absolute truth, you can't point out errors. Actually, there may be no absolute truth, but there are absolute falsities which can be pointed out.
All right. This is really puts the ball in my court as a constructionist. But in terms of truth, I think if there is an accepted truth, for example, in counting or statistics, and everyone agrees that then you can manipulate, you can corrode, you can undermine, you can lie. So within a system of understanding that is agreeable in terms of the way our culture lives, yeah, the kinds of things that the right wing are doing, certainly in the United States, are abominable. And they can get away with it in some ways because they don't read anything else that would contradict them. As our news media are so divided that we live in different worlds. So Trump doesn't have to worry about being the 18 corrections on distortions in his talks, because no one will read the news in which those corrections are listed. And fighting that is essential. However, in terms of right-wing ideology or orientation, I have to see that as a construction that makes sense within a form of life. And in the United States, look, most of the people who are far right or who've dropped out of the educational system and have been in some way cultural failures by us. We have failed them. We in our educational systems have made them such that they don't want to be in them. We have made the judgments which have created in some way a resistance to we who are international and drink espresso and embrace LGBT. I mean, all these things which we do and discount them. I understand that there can be a sense that our way of life is déclassé, and we are going out to for revenge. I understand that, but and although I rail against that ideology, in my heart, I know somehow in the long run we've got to embrace the multiple realities, that we've got to have the forms of dialogue that allow us to go on together and not make this a fight to the finish. So I admire, for example, an organization in the United States called Braver Angels, which is a large organization which goes from community to community trying to create dialogues between left and right with some success. And most fascinatingly, those are all psychologists who created those dialogues, therapists, community builders, and psychologists who are using those skills to say, we know how to create the kind of dialogue that begin at least to break down those barriers. So we just have, as much as I hate even to be it's very difficult for me to talk to people on the other side of politics. I've got to somehow find a way. We've got to find ways to break those down. And as psychologists, I think we have some insights to offer on those grounds.
Well, unfortunately, we're reaching to the end. Thank you all very much for all these reflections and also for your questions in the chat. And before finishing, I would really like to thank especially the Taos Institute for allowing this to happen. And I would also really like to thank you, both you two, Michael and Ken. I hope that besides, if this was interesting for anyone, that you had a really good time here talking the one to the other. That was one of the main aims of this meeting as well. I also remember, for those of you who are Spanish speakers, that you have a 20% discount in the books of Ideology and Opinions from Michael Billig translated into Spanish, and also the Relational Imperative translated into Spanish by Ken. And besides this, I would strongly thank all of you, all of those who were part of this, who made this possible. It is fantastic that we had so many people here today, because this really helps us to think that there is a public for this and to keep going with this kind of events, this kind of books, and this kind of gazes to look at psychology in a different way. So thank you very much to all of you for attending this session. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, Michael. If you would like to say some final words, the floor is yours.
Okay, I just want to say one final word, which is an apology, a real apology, but I don't speak Spanish. Don't understand it. I do apologize.
Oh, I want to thank so many of the people in this audience as I've been finally able to go through, who have been so much part of everything that's gone on here, and everything I've said in some way reflects voices that are there. Some of you have actually written work with, and I mean, that is the community from which I draw. And I may not reflect it well, but I thank you for all the words you have given me.
I think that I don't know if you are seeing the chat, Ken and Michael, but everyone is so grateful for your nice reflections and also for these kind of words. So thank you very much. We will upload the recording of this event soon. We will send you an email with all the details so you can go back to it. And thank you very much also to Sylvia, who is translating on the other channel. Alex and Lupi for your collaboration. And I hope we can see each other very, very soon with another event, with another book, with another translation, with so many other things that we have to still co-create. Thank you very much.